Chapter 16, World War II, Part 1. A second World War erupts. Stalin's deal with Hitler, August 1939. Should England ally with Russia against Hitler? As distasteful as the idea was to him, Churchill in April of 1939 advised Parliament that the only hope Europe had at that point was the formation of some kind of alliance with Soviet Russia. To some extent, this was in response to feelers put out by the Soviets, probably inspired by the Soviet Foreign Minister Litvinov, who still held out hope for a working relationship with the English and the French. But Chamberlain was appalled at the idea and did his best to head it off, even though it was beginning to make sense to more and more English, including Chamberlain's military advisors. Stalin having second thoughts about the French and English. Meanwhile, Stalin, who had been counting on the French and the English to counter Hitler's moves, was becoming more and more convinced that the English and the French were rather useless as allies. In fact, Stalin began to develop suspicions that the West was operating with the purpose of directing Hitler's aggressions purposely eastward, towards Russia. In early May 1939, Litvinov, after 9 years of service, trying to build a strong Russian, French, and English collaboration, was relieved by Stalin of his duties as foreign minister. He was replaced by Vyacheslav Molotov, someone who had come to the conclusion that it was time to give up the idea of cooperative diplomacy with the West and to seek some kind of arrangement with Hitler as Russia's only hope of security at this point. It was time to do a deal with the devil Hitler, such as Chamberlain had been doing, a deal designed to head Hitler westward towards France and Britain. But Molotov's appointment was not a complete reversal of Stalin's thinking in Soviet foreign policy, not yet anyway. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, August 23, 1939. But as the summer progressed, the Molotov viewpoint began to gather strength in Stalin's thinking. In late August, Stalin turned to Hitler to see what kind of favorable terms could be worked out with him. Much to the surprise of the world, on August 23rd, a non-aggression pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Treaty, between Germany and Russia was announced. To the world, an agreement of non-aggression between Russia and Germany sounded like a very good thing. But what the world did not know was that as part of this pact, Hitler and Stalin had secretly agreed on respective spheres of German and Russian control in Eastern Europe, and in particular, had agreed to invade and divide up a conquered Poland between them. In Russia, Stalin saw this act as creating something of an additional land buffer between Russia and Germany. He hoped that this would satisfy Hitler's land lust in the East and give Hitler the opportunity to turn his attentions to the West, to France, and even to England. Stalin presumed that with the outbreak of war in the West, the French and the English would have to come to their senses and stand up to Hitler. He was hoping that this would lock Germany in a long, protracted war in the West that could take the German pressure off Russia for a very long time. And if he were very lucky, the Germans, French, and English would all destroy each other again, like they had in the Great War. In Germany, with the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Treaty, Hitler felt that he had the one last concern, opposition from the Russians, removed. Hitler was now ready to seize the German-Polish lands to the east that had been assigned to Poland in its re-establishment as a nation after World War I. These lands would now be united to a greater Germany, and the Poles living on these lands dealt with as the need arose. Nothing, least of all Chamberlain's idle threat of war, now stood in the way of Hitler achieving his great victory for the German Volk, or people. The decision was quickly made. Poland would be invaded on September the 1st by a huge array of German dive bombers, tanks, and mobile troops. Blitzkrieg was about to get underway. The war in Poland. The Germans invade Poland. On September 1st, Hitler's troops invaded Poland without any formal warning and began to blast Poland into bloody submission. England and France declared war against Germany on September the 3rd for this action against Poland, but within 2 weeks, Polish resistance to the German invaders was limited to several small pockets. The stab in the back of the Poles by the Soviet Red Army. There was a little over a 2-week delay until September the 17th in the movement of the Soviet Red Army into Poland. The Poles did not know about the secret provisions of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Treaty by which Hitler and Stalin had decided to divide up Poland between them. So when the Russians did finally cross into Poland, the Poles thought the Russians were coming to aid them against the Germans. Too late. The Poles realized that the Russians were invaders as well. The Germans and Russians finally closed forces against the Poles at Brest-Litovsk. By the 28th of September, the last Polish pocket of resistance was crushed. On the 29th, Poland was formally partitioned between Germany and Russia. Soviet Russia was just as guilty for its part in starting the war, and its treatment of the Poles would be no less cruel. But the English and the French would not declare war on Russia, as they had on Germany, for this invasion of Poland. The Katyn Forest Massacre. One of the saddest features of this Russian invasion was the disappearance of about 22,000 Polish officers, civilian officials, intellectuals, etc., seized during the Russian occupation of eastern Poland from 1939 to 1941. In 1943, the Germans, in invading the Russian sector of Poland, announced that they had discovered mass graves at the Katyn Forest. Stacks of Poles, piled high, had been massacred by the Russians. The Polish government in exile in London asked the International Red Cross to investigate the graves, leading Stalin to break relations with the exiled Polish government. Stalin set up his own Polish government, which he later installed in Poland as his Red Army swept through Poland in 1945 in pursuit of the Germans. At the post-war crimes trials, the Soviets even attempted to pin the blame for the massacres on Germans, who had supposedly confessed their hand in the massacre. But the matter was dropped when the Americans and English proved not to be convinced by the Russian accusations. It was, in fact, not until 1990 that the Russians finally confessed that the massacre in the Katyn Forest and other similar sites had been specifically ordered by Stalin and Molotov. The Russo-Finnish War, 1939-1940. Stalin, now nervous about German advances into Poland, despite their treaty which set up the whole scenario, in October pressed his neighbors, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, to sign 3 mutual assistance pacts, which then legitimatized the Russian Red Army's entry into those countries and their absorption into the Soviet Empire. He then turned on another neighbor, the Finns, forcing them to give grants of land to the Russians in order to put more land buffer around Leningrad, that is, St. Petersburg. When the Finns refused, Stalin in December 1939 ordered Helsinki bombed, and the Soviet army to move into Finland. But the Finns put up a stiff resistance, and the winter proved cruel to the Russian invaders, many of whom simply froze in the snow. Stalin ordered a second, larger invasion in February of 1940. France and England hesitantly came forward with offers of aid to the Finns, but even that was too long delayed. Meanwhile, though the Russians had lost 250,000 troops to Finland's 25,000 troops, the losses were comparatively heavier on the Finnish population, and by mid-March, the Finns were defeated. The result of this war was the ceding of large strips of Finnish borderland to Russia and the falling of the remainder of Finland under Soviet domination. The Sitzkrieg in the European West, September 1939 to April 1940. Having declared war against Germany, the English and the French then proceeded to do nothing, thus missing a valuable opportunity to catch Hitler off guard in the West while he was fully engaged in the East in Poland. Once again, it looked as if the Western democracies just simply had lost all nerve against Hitler. During the rest of the fall, then into the winter, and then spring of 1940, the Western Front was quiet. Some in Germany already began to ridicule the war with England and France by playing on Hitler's doctrine of Blitzkrieg, lightning war. The critics call this war in the West a Sitzkrieg, or sitting war. Others had their own term of contempt for the British and French inaction, terming it the phony war. The Battle of the Atlantic begins 1939-1940. The only serious military action between England and Germany in this early phase of the war was on the high seas. The naval war began in the British naval harbor at Scapa Flow, when a German U-boat slipped inside and sank the battleship Royal Oak on October the 17th. But with respect to naval action, the Germans were up against the newly appointed First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, who was quite ready to take up the war aggressively at sea and met with some success. A huge naval victory came to the British when 3 English cruisers chased the German pocket battleship Graf Spee into the neutral port of Montevideo. The German captain, running low on fuel and ammunition, and supposing incorrectly that the English were assembling a mighty naval armada around the exit of the River Platte, decided to scuttle the ship rather than surrender it to the English, December 13th. This loss of the German battleship proved the only bright moment for the English during the Sitzkrieg of winter of 1939-1940, and a boost to the reputation of the First Lord of the Admiralty, Churchill. The end of the Sitzkrieg, or phony war. The Battle of Norway and Denmark, April 1940. Germany was nearly totally dependent for imports of iron ore for her Ruhr-based steel industry. Some of it came from Alsace-Lorraine, a region restored to France as a result of the Versailles Treaty. Now, with war having begun, that source was totally cut off. But almost 3/4 of their ore had come anyway from the rich iron fields of northern Sweden. Sweden was a neutral in the mounting conflict, but the most direct route for the ore from Sweden to Germany via the Baltic was frozen over during the winter. Only the route across northern Norway through the port of Narvik was ice-free year-round. Besides, this was the route that ore reached England from Sweden, providing England with 10% of its iron ore needs. Thus, the port of Narvik was strategic for both Germany and England. Without this ore, Germany would be helpless. And England not only needed some of the ore itself, but cutting off the route to Germany would be a huge gain for England in its newly declared war against Germany. On the other hand, holding a position in Norway would give Germany naval and air position from which to attack Britain. Hitler had carefully prepared his move on Norway, cultivating a fifth column of pro-Nazi Norwegians, led by the Norwegian collaborator Major Quisling, who would aid the German takeover of the country by seizing airfields and ports for the Nazis. The Germans then would be parachuted into the country, or would invade various Norwegian ports by amphibious assaults from a flotilla of ships. Thus, in early April of 1940, Hitler struck out against Denmark and Norway, and the war in the West was no longer a sitting war. The Norwegians fought fiercely, but were soon overwhelmed by the well-planned German invasion. The Norwegian king and cabinet made their escape to England as the country fell to the Germans. Many Norwegians took to the mountains to keep up something of a guerrilla action against the Germans, which never let up during the full run of the war. Meanwhile, totally unprepared Denmark fell quickly, in only one day of action, to the Germans. Unlike the Norwegians, the Danes offered no further resistance to the German occupation. The Battle of the Netherlands and Belgium, May 1940. Then Hitler turned on his neighbors directly to the west of Germany. On May 9th, German troops struck into Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, sweeping westward well to the north of the famous Maginot Line of French fortifications. German parachute troops were dropped ahead of motorized German infantry, seizing airfields, strategic crossroads, and bridges, as the Dutch countered by flooding their fields and trying to blow up bridges. But the Germans moved so quickly that mostly such efforts by the Dutch of self-defense availed little. 3 days later, the Dutch Queen and cabinet ministers escaped to England, and the next day Rotterdam was completely laid waste by the Germans as a demonstration to the Dutch of what resistance to the German occupiers would gain them. Thus, Dutch resistance collapsed. The Belgians experienced the same blitzkrieg strategy of the Germans, though they held out for over 2 weeks against the Germans. Then, on May 28th, Belgian King Leopold surrendered himself to the Germans, and Belgian resistance died away. Footnote. Because Leopold did not follow the Norwegian and Dutch example and flee to England, but instead surrender himself to the Germans, after the war, he was viewed by many Belgians as being something of a traitor, an appraisal he was never able to live down. The British were stunned by these huge German successes. In England, Chamberlain sensed growing opposition to his leadership and was rejected by Parliament in his effort to create a broad National Front cabinet. At this point, Parliament wanted Churchill to lead the nation, and the King indeed did ask him to take over on the 10th of May. 3 days later, in a speech before Parliament, the new Prime Minister told the country that he could offer no quick road to victory, but only blood, toil, tears, and sweat. But his aim was complete victory, for without victory there is no survival, he stated. The British were ready to stand strong with Churchill now leading them. The fall of France, June 1940. Meanwhile, the French were struggling to fend off the Germans. The French had already replaced as Prime Minister the German appeaser Daladier with the staunch anti-German Paul Reynaud in March, who had tried to move quickly to ready France for the coming encounter with Germany. But much valuable time had run out for the French, time needed to prepare for the inevitable. Reynaud had tried to help the Norwegians, though Chamberlain's withdrawal of British forces from Norway on April 28th then forced the French to have to pull back. Strategic thinking. Expecting the Germans to attack France across the hills of central Belgium, similar to the Schlieffen strategy the Germans had adopted in 1914 at the beginning of the Great War, French commander Maurice Gamelin had wanted as early as March to move French forces north across Belgium to the Netherlands to be in a position to swing behind the Germans were they to attack through Belgium. But at the time, both Belgium and the Netherlands had declared their neutrality, and Gamelin had the option only to mass huge numbers of French troops in the northwest along the Belgian border in anticipation of an eventual German attack. Here, French troops were joined by British troops, much in the manner of the Great War, which was beginning to be understood as World War I now that World War II was clearly taking place. But several mistakes were involved in French and British thinking. They still did not understand blitzkrieg and planned to move with concentrations of conventional troops against the Germans, who, however, were less numerous than the French and British allies because the Germans had lost a large number of troops in Poland. Their plans rested on the notion that it would take several weeks for the Germans to get across Belgium. In fact, it only took a few days, giving the Allies time to secure their positions in Belgium and the Netherlands. But the Germans had no such plans for a massed assault against the French, but rather a lightning-quick strike slicing through the dense Ardennes forests. Information reaching the French indeed gave indication that such a strategy might be in the making, but sadly Gamelin was certain that the Ardennes would be too difficult for the Germans to navigate, and expected the Germans to move further north through Belgium, where the Allies would be waiting for them. The German attack through the Ardennes forest. On May 10th, the attack through the Ardennes got underway. Parachuted troops were dropped to secure vital bridges across the rivers that threaded through the Ardennes mountains, and German tanks and motor vehicles had relatively little difficulty moving swiftly down the lightly defended roads that led through the Ardennes. They then reached northern France and cut right through the middle of the French lines, separating the troops gathered behind the Maginot Line in the French east from the French and British troops gathered in northern France and western Belgium. The Allies fought stiffly and hit the Germans hard, but strategically speaking, they had been put in an untenable position. The first of the German troops reached the Meuse River May the 12th, and Paris was now very vulnerable. But then the German offensive turned west, with the clear intention of pushing the Allies backward to the sea in order to protect the German right flank in its attack on Paris, eliminating the entire combined French, British, and Belgian forces still fighting in that area. The Germans also had huge numbers of French troops trapped in the east of France behind the Maginot Line, a well-developed French line of defense, which, however, was aimed toward Germany and not towards the rear facing the French interior, making it at that point quite useless. By the 16th of May, with Germans rolling rapidly towards the English Channel, Churchill flew to Paris to try to restore French morale, only to find that General Gamelin seemed to have lost all hope for his French troops. Footnote. Contrast this attitude to that of Churchill, who on June the 4th informed Parliament and the British nation, quote, "We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. But the French had nothing left to throw against the Germans, and on May the 19th, Renaud placed Gamelin with Weygand in the hope of reinvigorating the French effort. But Weygand did not understand the need for urgency and moved slowly in organizing a counteroffensive against the overstretched German lines. Ultimately, it was again too little, too late. The only serious counteroffensive action undertaken against the Germans was led by General Charles de Gaulle, increasingly operating on his own. Brave though it was hardly adequate considering the gravity of the situation. Allied escape from Dunkirk and Cherbourg. With the Germans moving quickly to the west, they reached the Channel by May 20th. The situation facing the Allies was almost hopeless. Then, on the 23rd, the Germans made the decision to halt their advance and consolidate their position. Concerns were raised in Berlin. This would allow the Allied armies the opportunity to escape the trap, though German Air Marshal Hermann Göring assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe would prevent any such escape if the Allies attempted it. But on May 26, Churchill called on every available ship, fishing boat, anything that floated, to head to the Belgian port of Dunkirk to help rescue the Allies from the German encirclement. Fortunately for the Allies, the Luftwaffe was slow to respond, and renewed French action to the south at Lille drew German troops away from the German position around Dunkirk. This allowed over the next days, May the 26th to June the 4th, some 338,000 French and British troops to escape to England. There were serious losses from Luftwaffe airstrikes, but the Royal Air Force, RAF, put up a stiff resistance, helping immensely in the operation. Some 2 weeks later, another huge group of Allied troops, some 200,000, were rescued from the Brittany Peninsula at Cherbourg, though this time with a much larger loss of Allied lives, some 4,000 in the operation. But at this point, it was all but over for the French. The French were defending a broad but thinly held front, unable to move quickly to meet German attacks because of the millions, 6 to 10 million by some estimates, of civilians crowding the roads trying to get away from the fighting. The Germans on June the 5th resumed their attack to the south towards Paris. By June the 10th, they had reached the suburbs of Paris. Then Mussolini decided to become the great warrior he believed himself to be and declared war on France and Britain, also on June the 10th, and invaded southern France, making little headway in the attack. On June 14th, French troops, not wanting to see Paris destroyed in a hopeless defense of the city, pulled out of Paris, leaving it entirely in the hands of the German army. The French continued to fight on in the east behind the Maginot Line, but one by one French army units were forced to surrender, most of them by June 25th. For France, the war was over. Vichy France. Realizing that his French cabinet, which had retreated south to the city of Tours, had lost the will to fight on June 16th, Renaud resigned, or was forced to resign, and World War I French hero Marshal Philippe Pétain took over as Prime Minister. He agreed to meet with Hitler to sign an armistice, and Hitler designated the meeting to be held on the 22nd in the very same railroad car, serving as a French monument in the Compiègne forest, where the Germans had signed the armistice forced on them in 1918. For Hitler personally, this was a major payback. Fighting was designated at Compiègne to end on June 25th. France was then divided into two zones, one in the north, including Paris and most of France's industrial territory, under direct German administration, and one in the south under a new French government operating out of the resort town of Vichy, headed by Pétain. The Germans allowed the Vichy government to keep its overseas colonial territories and a small portion of its navy for defense of those colonies, and in theory full sovereignty within its zone so that life could supposedly go on as it was before the war. Also, some 2 million French soldiers remained as forced labor prisoners in German-occupied Europe and as hostages, ensuring Vichy compliance with the terms of the armistice. Then, gradually, Pétain's Vichy government itself took on a stronger fascist tone, becoming virulently anti-Jewish, and, after Hitler's invasion of Russia in June of 1941, virulently anti-communist. But General Charles de Gaulle had refused to recognize any form of French surrender, as per his BBC speech from London on June 18th, and rejected entirely Pétain's Vichy government. De Gaulle then began to organize a Free French Army and a French government in exile in London. Now, Renault had been arrested by the Germans and was not a participant in the London government. But for the time being, there was actually little that the French could do about their situation. The Battle of Britain begins. Only the offshore island of Great Britain remained unconquered in the west. Footnote. Actually, Ireland, Spain, Portugal, and Switzerland, as well as Sweden, remained neutral, and Hitler surprisingly would respect that neutrality, perhaps only because for the time being he was deeply involved elsewhere. At first, Hitler had expected a British request for an armistice and planned to be generous in the negotiations. But when, in his famous finest hour speech before Parliament on June 18th, Churchill made it again clear that even with the fall of France, he refused to consider any notion except total victory in this war, Hitler thus became determined to bring Britain as well to humiliating defeat. Footnote. Quote, Churchill. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life and the long continuity of our institutions and our empire. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of a perverted science. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will say, this was their finest hour. Operation Sea Lion was thus birthed in Hitler's mind, but he had no idea how difficult a channel crossing might be and how unready his German troops were for such a venture. He himself believed that an invasion of Britain could bring Britain to its knees by mid-August. Thus, despite warnings from his generals, in July, Hitler began his aerial bombardment of British convoys in the English Channel in preparation for his intended cross-channel invasion of that country. Then on the 12th of August, the Germans hit radar installations on the English coast in preparation for the beginning of the bombing of England itself on the following day. Savagely, he hit British airfields, docks, ships, and industries. But the RAF fought back skillfully, as did the anti-aircraft gunners defending Britain from the ground. Consequently, the Luftwaffe's losses were huge. Furthermore, downed German pilots became prisoners in Britain, but British pilots could parachute out of a downed plane and return to action with a new plane. In any case, the British showed no signs of yielding. As a huge gamble, on August 15th, Hitler sent a force of 1,000 planes to attack Britain, losing 180 planes in the process. Indeed, in a week's time, the Germans lost 492 planes to the RAF's loss of 115 planes. Things clearly were not working out well for Hitler and his Operation Sea Lion. Then the British retaliated by sending bombers to Berlin on August 25th. Materially, not a matter of great significance, but spiritually a devastating blow to Hitler's Germany. This was the first time that the Germans had felt the effects of war on their own ground since the days of Napoleon. Hitler was furious. On September 7th, Hitler shifted his attack from English airfields to London itself, more horrible in destruction, but a strategic distraction, foolishly sparing British fighter command at a time that the British were actually having a hard time replacing lost fighter planes. Finally, an air battle on September 15th with huge German air losses caused Hitler to postpone Operation Sea Lion to the following year, 1941. Footnote: it would then be postponed again to the next spring, 1942, at which Hitler, because of his deep involvement in Russia, called the whole thing off. Nonetheless, the Battle of Britain continued with widely spread German attacks on England's cities and towns, with London receiving the worst of it. But this was a costly venture for the Germans, losing 2-1 in the downing of planes. July to October of 1940, 1,733 German planes versus 915 British planes downed. It was now the turn of the British to send bombers to Germany to destroy mines, factories, railroads, etc. in the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. In the meantime, while England was suffering a similar fate, the British were nonetheless finally beginning to produce significantly more fighter planes for the RAF. Then, with the German invasion of Soviet-Russian territory in June of 1941, the German air attacks on Britain dwindled. The Tripartite or Axis Pact, September 27, 1940. When Germany signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Treaty in 1939, this seems to overturn the provisions of Germany's earlier anti-Comintern, that is, anti-communist, or actually anti-Soviet pact. Footnote: the Comintern was simply an abbreviated name for the Communist International, basically an alliance of the various communist parties found throughout the European nations, all more or less under the direction of Stalin. The goal of the Comintern was supposedly the overthrow of capitalism and the establishment of a single working-class society. But mostly the Comintern served Soviet goals, as Stalin directed those goals. Hitler resolved this issue with a new Tripartite or Axis Pact, signed in Berlin on September 27, 1940, by Germany, Italy, and Japan. This not only gave considerable encouragement to Japan's imperial ambitions in Asia, at the expense of the English, French, and Dutch, and to the great irritation of America, it put Germany on record as willing to come to war as a Japanese ally if war should ever occur between Japan and America. With the signing of the Tripartite Pact, the Rome-Berlin axis now officially included also Tokyo, and the world now acknowledged those belonging to this military alliance as the Axis powers. American neutrality. After France's surrender in June of 1940, America began to take events developing in Europe much more seriously, and finally began to gear up for the possibility of war. The defense budget jumped from $2 billion to $10 billion in that year, and America's first peacetime draft was instituted. But still, America remained officially neutral. Britain, meanwhile, was struggling to keep vital supply lines open from overseas. But by early 1940, German U-boats were taking a huge toll on Atlantic shipping, sinking ships faster than Britain could replace them. Step by step, America began to increase its sales to Britain of vitally needed supplies, including in June, millions of rounds of surplus ammunition sold to Britain, and in September, including 50 mothballed destroyers given to Britain in exchange for land on which to build American air bases within the British Empire. By December of 1940, with Roosevelt's announcement that America was to become the arsenal for democracy, those supplies being sold to Britain openly included all varieties of war materials. However, there was still a strong spirit of isolationism in sections of American society, although in general the American population was beginning to swing to the idea that it was the country's responsibility to help Britain save civilization from the Nazi scourge. Lend-Lease. The idea of Lend-Lease was put before Congress and hotly debated. A majority of Democrats favored the idea of helping Britain in any way possible, and a majority of Republicans were opposed. Finally, by March of 1941, the bill authorizing Lend-Lease was approved by both houses of Congress, thanks to the Democrat vote. The new law permitted the president to sell, transfer title, exchange, lend, or lease anything to any government whose defense the president deemed vital to the defense of the United States. Such partner governments included immediately Britain, but soon also China, and then that autumn, Russia as well. With the sinking of an American destroyer by a German submarine at the end of October 1941, the last of the Neutrality Acts passed and reconfirmed nearly every year in the second half of the 1930s were finally repealed, and American ships, merchant ships, were allowed to be armed and themselves to transport war material to Britain. All that at this point, America's claim to be a neutral in the war was clearly a fiction which Hitler chose, mostly, still to observe. June 1941, Hitler attacks Russia, Operation Barbarossa. By September of 1940, with the British Royal Air Force still in the air and able to fight off German air cover needed for any invading ground forces, Hitler came to the conclusion that he would have to postpone the planned invasion of England. With this humiliation of not being able to deliver on a promised conquest of England, Hitler felt the pressure to strike elsewhere in testimony of Aryan greatness. By December of 1940, he was making plans to make good on a long-standing promise to convert the Slavic lands to the east, principally the Ukraine, into a breadbasket for Germany and Lebensraum, that is, living room for living, for an expanding Aryan German society and culture. Germans could also use the inferior people, the Untermenschen, of the Slavic lands as a source of slave labor to strengthen Germany's industrial capabilities. And seized oil fields of Azerbaijan would also aid in the strengthening of Germany. Also, Hitler was certain that in seeing Russia defeated, England would finally lose heart and accept any kind of peace deal with Germany it could get. Some of Hitler's generals prepared a study that demonstrated that the venture would cost more than it would gain. But Hitler, by this time positive that he had special, almost mystical, skills to see possibilities where other mortals, including importantly his generals, were blind, ignored their arguments. Plans were set for an invasion of the East in mid-May of the next year, 1941. Through the winter of 1940-1941, the Germans began massing huge amounts of troops along the German-Russian occupation line in Poland. But Stalin was not exactly unprepared. Actually, he had vastly more tanks and planes at hand than did the Germans, although because of his purges of the Red Army in 1937-39, his officers were young and inexperienced. But still, Stalin was not really ready to face the possibility that war with Germany was at hand. Churchill warned Stalin that through his military intelligence, he had every reason to believe that Hitler was indeed about to attack Russia. Stalin would not hear of it, claiming that Churchill was simply trying to start something between the Russians and the Germans just to get the Germans off the English backs. But indeed, on June 22nd, 1941, Hitler sent his troops rolling into Russian-controlled Poland. Their momentum soon had the Germans on Soviet soil itself. Part of Hitler's army raced towards the northeast, trying to seize Leningrad, that is, St. Petersburg. Another section of his army made a lunge towards the southeast, through the Ukraine. Amazingly, the Ukrainians came out to greet their liberators with flowers and cheers. Well, the Ukrainians hated Stalin and the Russian communists. Simply amazing. Not really. Hitler was furious when he heard that his soldiers were fraternizing with the Ukrainians and ordered them instead to start rounding up the Untermenschen for slave labor service. This bit of arrogance was a key factor in crippling Hitler's plan to overrun the Soviet Union, at least in the South. Rather than surrender, the Russians employed the same strategy that had worked so successfully when Napoleon and his French army invaded Russia back in 1812. The Russians fell back, burning their own lands to keep crops and herds from being of use to the invaders. Back they went, and then further back. German supply lines became overstretched and supplies lacking. Russian partisan groups began hit-and-run sniping and skirmishing with German patrols. Even the Ukrainians began to join the partisans, attacking vulnerable positions in the German lines. The Germans retaliated with incredible acts of cruel revenge enacted on the conquered civilians. The hatred between the two sides became intense. Then the cold weather of Russia began to set in. Blitzkrieg soon lost its momentum. Hitler's troops were now entangled in a draining war in the east, with ammunition, fuel, food, and warm clothing in very short supply, and the diesel engines in Hitler's tanks and trucks frozen up. The Germans found themselves unable to continue their advance. The offensive would have to wait until the spring thaw of 1942 before it could be resumed. But by that time, Blitzkrieg would have lost its momentum, and the Russians would be preparing a strong counteroffensive against the German invaders.